The night Elvis Presley locked the door at Graceland, it wasn't to keep fans out. It was to keep someone inside from getting in. And that's the part people don't like to say out loud, because once you say it, the whole legend tilts. The chandeliers, the gates, the guards, none of it matters if the man in the house is whispering that he doesn't feel safe in his own hallway. Dr. Nick got the call late, the kind of call that doesn't come with details, just urgency, a voice tight with fear, simple words rushed like footsteps. "Doc, he's not himself, he won't come out." When he arrived, the first thing he noticed wasn't chaos. It was the quiet. The wrong kind of quiet. Phones that usually never stopped suddenly held their breath. People who normally laughed too loud were speaking in half sentences. And somewhere upstairs, a door that was usually open because it was Elvis was shut, locked, like a line had finally been drawn. Later, Dr. Nick would say there was a night Elvis didn't feel like a king. He felt like a man trapped in a role everybody else needed him to play. And what made Graceland tremble wasn't the pills or the headlines or the rumors. It was the fear in Elvis's voice when he finally said what he'd been holding back. "I feel watched. Not by strangers. By people close enough to touch him." And if that sounds impossible, ask yourself this. What happens when a man becomes a business, a symbol, and a paycheck all at once? Does he still get to be human, or does he become property in a house with his name on the mailbox? Because that night wasn't just about a doctor being called to calm a patient down. It was about a witness stepping into a private war. A war Elvis could never fully win because the enemy wasn't outside the gates. It was in the schedule, in the expectations, in the deals, in the friends who never left, in the voices that kept saying you have to, even when Elvis didn't have anything left. And the cruelest part, everyone around him could call it love while it happened. So let's go back, before the locked door, before the whisper, before the night Graceland went silent, and talk about how a place built to be a sanctuary slowly started to feel like a stage you couldn't walk off. Because once you understand that, you understand why Elvis would look at his own doctor and ask a question that still tastes like panic. How do you get out when you're the reason everybody's here? Graceland is supposed to sound like safety. That name carries warmth in people's minds, like it's a soft place, a home, a refuge where Elvis could finally breathe after the lights, the screaming crowds, the burning pressure of being Elvis Presley every second he was awake. But the truth is, even a home can become a hallway with too many footsteps. Even a sanctuary can turn into a lobby. There were days Graceland didn't feel like a private house at all. It felt like a station. People arriving, people leaving, people carrying messages, requests, problems, plans, phones ringing with needs, doors opening because someone had to talk to him, conversations happening around him instead of with him. And at first, Elvis could handle it. Because he'd always handled it. That's what the world trained him to do: smile, give, perform, reassure, be gratitude in human form, be the miracle everyone wanted to stand near for a second so they could feel their own life brighten. But then the cracks started showing in places the public never saw. Not in his voice, not on stage, in the quiet moments, in the pauses between obligations, where a man finally sits down and realizes he hasn't truly been alone in years. And that's where Dr. Nick enters the story, not as some distant medical figure, but as one of the only people who could walk close enough to the real Elvis without asking him for an autograph, a favor, or a performance. To some, he was Doc. To Elvis, at times, he was something more dangerous. A doorway. Because when you're surrounded by people who need you, you start to hunger for someone who doesn't. A doctor doesn't need your spotlight. A doctor needs the truth. And the truth Elvis kept trying to swallow was simple and terrifying. He was tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Dr. Nick didn't just treat coughs and colds. He stood near the edge of a life that ran too hot for too long. He heard about the insomnia, those nights where Elvis couldn't shut his mind off, where the body finally lay down but the thoughts kept marching. He heard about the pain that clung to him after years of pushing past limits. And he also had to stand in the middle of something no medical school can prepare you for. A patient whose sickness isn't only physical. A patient whose greatest symptom is that he can't stop being himself. Because fame doesn't let you rest like a normal man. Fame doesn't say, take a week. Fame says, they're waiting, they paid, they booked, they expect. And in Elvis's world, there were always people who translated that pressure into one sentence. You can't cancel. At first it sounds like responsibility. Then it becomes a leash. It's subtle the way it happens. Nobody walks up and says, we are trapping you. They say you're needed. They say you're loved. They say you're saving everyone. And if you dare to complain, you're made to feel selfish for wanting air. Elvis lived inside that emotional math. Give the world everything and you'll be adored. Try to hold something back and you'll be punished with guilt. And the worst part, sometimes the guilt came from the people closest to him. Because the closer someone gets to the money, the schedule, the access, the harder it becomes for them to hear the word no without taking it personally. So Elvis learned to say yes even when his spirit said no. He learned to smile even when his chest felt tight. He learned to drown out the pressure the only way he knew how: quiet fixes, private escapes, things that worked quickly. And every quick fix came with a cost. That's the part Dr. Nick would later wrestle with. Because you can treat pain, you can sedate panic, you can coax somebody into sleep. But you can't prescribe freedom. You can't hand a man a bottle labeled peace. And you definitely can't cure the kind of loneliness that shows up while you're surrounded by people. There's a specific kind of sadness that only the famous understand. It's when a room full of people feels like a crowd, not family. When everyone is close, but nobody is with you. Elvis started dropping little lines, small cracks in conversation that sounded like jokes until you heard them twice. I just want one night when nobody needs me. I can't think in here. Or even softer, with a tired half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Feels like the house don't belong to me no more. And if you're Dr. Nick, those lines don't land as poetry. They land as warning signs. Because words like that aren't about mood. They're about a man losing his sense of control. That's when Graceland stopped being a simple location and started becoming two different places. There was Graceland for the world. The open doors, the laughter, the big energy, the constant movement, the calls answered, the visitors greeted, the image protected. That was door number one. Then there was Graceland for Elvis. The quieter rooms, the late nights, the moments when he didn't want to be seen, the moments when he didn't want to be touched by expectations. That was door number two. And door number two started closing more often. Not because Elvis wanted to punish anyone. Because Elvis needed to survive. He needed privacy the way drowning people need air. But when you close door number two, you create a new problem in a house full of people who believe they have a right to you. They start taking your silence personally. They start knocking harder. They start turning your boundary into an emergency. And that's where that specific night begins. A night that, according to people close to him, started with something small. A call he didn't want to take. A request he refused. Maybe a plan he didn't have the strength to follow through on. Whatever it was, it hit the atmosphere of the house like a storm warning. You could feel it in the way voices changed, in the way someone walked faster down the hall, in the way laughter died too quickly, like everyone suddenly remembered what was at stake. Because when Elvis said no, it didn't just disappoint people. It threatened the entire machine. And machines don't like slowing down. So someone did what they always did when Elvis wouldn't cooperate. They sent for Dr. Nick. Now think about the position that puts a person in. You're walking into a home where love, business, loyalty, fear, and control are tangled together like wires. One person says he needs help. Another person says he's being difficult. Someone else says just get him calm. And Elvis is upstairs trying to breathe through a life that won't stop pressing down on him. When Dr. Nick got to that room, Elvis wasn't throwing a tantrum. He wasn't raging like a star. He was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that scares you more than yelling ever could, because it feels like the moment right before someone breaks. Elvis looked at him like he'd been waiting. Not for medicine. For reality. For an adult in the room. For someone who wasn't going to turn his pain into a business decision. And that's when Elvis said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, almost like he was ashamed that he even had to say it. I can't do this tonight. Not I won't. I can't. Those are different words. Then another line, one that Dr. Nick would never forget because it didn't sound like exhaustion. It sounded like fear. If I try to leave, they'll make sure I don't. And in that moment, Dr. Nick understood something chilling. This wasn't only about health anymore. This was about power, about control, about who truly ran Graceland when the bedroom door was closed. Dr. Nick reached toward the phone because that's what you do when you think a situation is spiraling. You call for help, you bring in support, you try to stabilize the dangers. But Elvis moved fast. He grabbed his wrist. Not hard enough to hurt him. Hard enough to stop him. His eyes didn't look famous in that instant. They looked trapped. And his voice dropped even lower, like the walls had ears. Don't call anyone, Elvis whispered. Then he swallowed, glanced toward the hall like he could feel someone standing out there, even if nobody was. And he finished the sentence with a kind of dread that made the air feel heavier. Not them. The scary part wasn't that Elvis told Dr. Nick not to call anyone. The scary part was that Elvis didn't say it like a request. He said it like a rule that had already been enforced before. And once that line was spoken, the whole house changed shape. Because when a man like Elvis Presley whispers, not them, you don't hear celebrity drama. You hear fear with a name attached to it. After that night, Graceland didn't feel like one home anymore. It felt like two homes stacked on top of each other. The polite one downstairs, where everybody acted normal, and the quiet one upstairs, where every word sounded like it could be repeated to the wrong person. And that's when the dividing lines appeared. Not on paper, in the air. You could feel it in who stood closer to the stairs, in who answered the phone first, in who suddenly acted like they were protecting Elvis while also controlling who could reach him. The same people who said, "We're just trying to help," were now deciding what help looked like. And when the atmosphere gets like that, even a small decision becomes political. Who brings him food? Who handles his mail? Who talks to management? Who tells the outside world he's fine? Who gets to be in the room when his eyes look tired? Because access to Elvis wasn't just friendship. It was power. And Dr. Nick, whether he wanted it or not, had just become part of the power struggle. Not because he chased it, but because Elvis had pulled him into it with one grip on his wrist and one whisper in his ear. Not them. From that point forward, Dr. Nick started noticing patterns that didn't look like normal concern. They looked like control dressed up as loyalty. If Elvis slept late, someone would be irritated, not relieved. If Elvis wanted a quiet night, someone would treat it like betrayal. If Elvis avoided a call, somebody would insist he was overreacting, like his boundary was an insult. And every time Elvis tried to shrink his world down into something manageable, the world around him expanded again, people, plans, pressure, until he was right back in the center of it, spinning. That's what happens when you're the engine. Nobody lets the engine rest. They just pour more fuel on it and call it necessary. Dr. Nick's job was supposed to be simple: treat the symptoms, keep Elvis stable, keep him functional enough to make it through the next appearance, the next trip, the next night. But here the problem. The more Dr. Nick listened, the more he realized the symptoms weren't the real emergency. The real emergency was the environment. He could treat insomnia. He couldn't treat a life that never stopped knocking. He could calm anxiety. He couldn't calm the constant sense that Elvis's choices weren't really his anymore. And Elvis knew it. That's why his confessions started coming out sideways, not as neat speeches, but as fragments, half-sentences, quick admissions that slipped out before he could swallow them back down. I'm tired of people telling me what I feel. Ain't nobody listening, they just waiting. And one night, after the house finally quieted down and the laughter in the distance sounded forced, Elvis said something to Dr. Nick that made him go still. I'm not living in my house. He paused like he was embarrassed by how true it was. I'm performing in it. That line sounds dramatic until you picture it. Imagine waking up in your own bed and feeling like you owe everyone outside the door a version of yourself that they paid for. Imagine walking down your own hallway and seeing faces light up, not because they love you as a person, but because you're useful. Then imagine what that does to your trust. Because if everyone benefits from you being okay, who tells you the truth when you're not? Elvis started asking questions that didn't have safe answers. Who you think been talking? Who you think been telling them my business? Dr. Nick tried to calm him, tried to keep him grounded, but he could see something deeper happening under the surface. Elvis wasn't paranoid in a childish way. He was aware. He was watching the way information moved. Because in Graceland, news traveled like smoke, quiet, fast, and impossible to trace. A private moment in the morning could turn into everyone knows by nightfall. You didn't even have to say it out loud. The right person just had to notice it. And Elvis noticed everything. He noticed who got nervous when he asked certain questions. He noticed who changed the subject. He noticed who acted extra sweet right after he expressed distrust, like they were trying to smooth his suspicions down before they hardened into certainty. And slowly, something heartbreaking happened. Elvis began to feel alone around the people who were supposed to be closest to him. Because when trust breaks, love starts sounding like strategy. Even kindness starts feeling like manipulation. And Dr. Nick was stuck in the middle of it, because Elvis trusted him enough to confess, but that trust made Dr. Nick dangerous in the eyes of anyone who wanted to control the narrative. At first, it was subtle. A sarcastic comment. "So what he tell you tonight, Doc?" A look held a second too long. A pause when Dr. Nick entered a room, like conversations were being tucked away. But subtle pressure is still pressure. And it trains people to cooperate. That's the part most folks don't understand about being trapped. It doesn't always look like locks and chains. Sometimes it looks like everyone smiling while you lose your agency inch by inch. It looks like, "Let me handle that for you." It looks like, "You don't need to worry your head about it." It looks like decisions being made in the next room, then handed to you like they're gifts. And Elvis, who was used to controlling the room with a single glance, started feeling the room controlling him with 100 tiny moves. Then came the part that tightened everything. The deal. Not a deal with a signature you can point to in a file cabinet, though there were plenty of papers in Elvis's life, but a deal in the emotional sense. A trade. Elvis would keep going. Elvis would keep showing up. Elvis would keep the machine running. And in return, he'd be protected from what? From scandal. From embarrassment. From being seen as weak. From whatever threats the business side of the world implied without ever saying directly. Because when you're a legend, people don't just fear your collapse. They fear losing control of the story. And once Elvis started pulling away, the quiet reminders started showing up more often. Not necessarily threatening in tone, just firm in implication. People are counting on you. You can't do that right now. We'll handle it. And we'll handle it can sound warm until you realize it means you don't get to decide. Elvis tried to reclaim small pieces of himself. Sometimes it was as simple as wanting a night without visitors. Sometimes it was refusing a call. Sometimes it was pushing back on a schedule. But every attempt to set a boundary created a reaction that felt bigger than the boundary itself. Like the house couldn't tolerate Elvis being unavailable. Like his availability was the rent everybody paid to live in his orbit. That's when Elvis started doing something that, to Dr. Nick, felt like a cry for help. He started talking in metaphors. He'd stare off, quiet for a long time, then say something like, "Feels like I'm standing in the middle of the road and everybody driving through me. Or, I don't know who to believe." Then he'd look at Dr. Nick like he was begging for an answer a doctor doesn't have the power to give. How do you tell them no without them turning on you? That's the hostage logic. Not that someone is holding a gun to your head, but that the consequences of resistance feel so catastrophic you comply to avoid the explosion. Because what happens if Elvis stops? People lose money. People lose access. People lose identity. People lose the story they tell themselves about being close to him. And when a crowd stands to lose, it pressures the one man who can save them, whether he's bleeding inside or not. That's why Elvis's fear wasn't just sadness. It was strategic. He was noticing who needed him too much. Then came the moment that Dr. Nick would later describe with the kind of careful language people use when they're still afraid of what happens when you say the truth plainly. It began with a request. Not from Elvis. From someone else in the house. Something slipped into Dr. Nick's orbit that made him realize his role wasn't just medical. It was becoming administrative, protective, convenient. A situation where the easiest solution, at least for certain people, was to have the doctor create a reason. A reason Elvis couldn't move. A reason Elvis couldn't be disturbed. A reason Elvis couldn't be reached. Because if Elvis was under the doctor's orders, then whoever controlled the doctor controlled the boundary. And once that door opens, it's hard to close. Dr. Nick came to understand that Elvis is sick could be used like a weapon. Not to hurt Elvis directly, but to steer him. To keep certain people out. To keep certain plans in place. To keep Elvis where everyone needed him, contained, managed, predictable. And Elvis knew what was happening. One night he said it in a way that didn't leave any space for misunderstanding. "They'll take everything," Elvis murmured, voice low and rough, "and they'll call it help." Dr. Nick tried to soothe him, tried to anchor him in the present, but Elvis wasn't spiraling into fantasy. He was describing his lived reality. Then he said something that made Dr. Nick's stomach tighten, because it sounded like a man confessing he'd lost his last safe corner. "I don't even know who in this house is mine anymore." That's a brutal thing to say. Because Graceland wasn't just a building. It was his myth, his refuge, his symbol of home. And here he was, sitting in it like it was enemy territory. Dr. Nick looked at him and saw the cost. Not just the physical toll, the emotional toll of being adored by millions and still feeling like you have to negotiate your own privacy with the people next to you. Elvis had a way of carrying his pain like a secret, even when it was crushing him. He'd joke, he'd flirt, he'd charm, he'd deflect. But in those private exchanges, the mask slipped. And Dr. Nick realized he wasn't just hearing complaints. He was hearing a warning. Elvis believed someone was reporting on him, feeding details outward. And whether or not Elvis could prove it didn't even matter anymore, because the belief alone is enough to poison a home. Once you think someone is listening, you start measuring every word. Once you think someone is watching, you start living like you're on trial. And that's when Graceland truly started to tremble, not physically, but emotionally. Because tension doesn't stay quiet forever. It builds, it pushes, it seeks air. And in a house full of egos and loyalties and money, eventually someone wants to shut the truth down before it gets loose. Dr. Nick felt it coming. He felt it in the way a room stiffened when he walked in. He felt it in the forced laughter. He felt it in the way someone would step between him and Elvis for no reason at all, like they were casually marking territory. And then it happened. Footsteps outside the door. Not casual, purposeful. A stop. A pause that felt like a decision being made. Then a voice, close enough to the wood that it sounded like it was already inside the room. "Doc," the voice said. Not angry, not friendly. Controlled. "We need to talk, right now." And in that moment, Dr. Nick understood the real danger of knowing too much. Because Elvis might have been the one in the spotlight. But the house had rules. And one of the oldest rules in places like that is simple. The person who threatens the system becomes the problem. Even if all he did was listen to the truth. Even if all he did was try to help a man who finally whispered what nobody wanted to hear. "I don't feel free in my own home. Doc, we need to talk, right now." The words weren't shouted, that's what made them worse. They landed like a hand closing around a doorknob, calm, certain, like whoever spoke them already knew the outcome. And for a split second, Dr. Nick felt something he didn't like admitting to himself. Not irritation. Not defensiveness. Fear. Because when a house starts deciding who gets to speak to Elvis, and when, and about what, that's not care anymore. That's custody. Dr. Nick didn't answer right away. He glanced at Elvis, and Elvis didn't look surprised. He looked tired, like he'd been expecting this moment the way you expect thunder after lightning. Elvis kept his voice low. "Don't let M in here." It wasn't a demand. It was a plea disguised as confidence. Dr. Nick stepped toward the door anyway, because ignoring it would only make the pressure heavier. He cracked it just enough to see faces, posture, the stance of people who weren't asking permission. The man closest leaned in, eyes sharp but mouth polite. "We just want to make sure everything's okay," he said. It sounded reasonable, but Dr. Nick noticed the hidden message. "We are here because it's not okay, and we don't like that you're the one in the room when it is." "Everything's fine," Dr. Nick told him. The man's smile didn't change. "Then you don't mind stepping out for a minute." A normal house, that sentence means nothing. In this house, it meant, "We need to remind you where you stand." Dr. Nick hesitated. Behind him, Elvis shifted, quiet, restless, like a man bracing for someone to grab the last thread of his control and snap it. Dr. Nick stepped into the hall, the door closed behind him, and suddenly the air felt colder. Not literally, socially, the temperature of loyalty. The man spoke softly, but the softness had teeth. "Doc, we appreciate you, we do, but you know how it is. He gets worked up, says things. Next thing you know, folks start taking it wrong. We just need you to keep him calm." Keep him calm. That phrase had been used around Elvis like holy water. Sprinkle it on any situation and it sounds responsible. But Dr. Nick heard a second sentence inside it. Keep him quiet. He held the man's gaze. "My job is to take care of him." "Exactly," the man said, nodding like they were on the same page. "That's what we're saying." And that's when Dr. Nick realized what made Graceland so hard to navigate. Nobody ever threatened you outright. They just wrapped control in agreement until it felt rude to refuse. He went back inside. Elvis was sitting in that still way that looks calm until you get close enough to see the tension in the jaw, the slight shake in the fingers, the eyes that keep traveling to the door as if they can hear intentions. Elvis didn't ask what was said. He already knew the category. Instead, he asked the question that mattered. What they want. Dr. Nick answered carefully, "They want you calm." Elvis gave a small laugh that wasn't humor, it was disbelief. "They always want me calm." Then his face fell, and the room went quiet in a way that felt like a confession forming. "You know what I think, Doc." Dr. Nick waited. Elvis looked up, and for a moment the legend slipped so far away you could almost forget it had ever existed. "I think they only love me when I'm easy." That line hit harder than any wild rumor could, because it wasn't scandal, it was loneliness. Elvis leaned back, eyes on the ceiling like he was trying to find a crack in it big enough to escape through. "I can fill arenas," he said, voice rough. "I can make M scream, I can make M cry, I can walk out there and give M everything they came for." He swallowed. "And I can't fill this room." He said it like the room itself was the problem, like the air inside Graceland didn't belong to him anymore. Dr. Nick tried to pull him back from the edge. "Elvis, you got people who care about you." Elvis stared at him, and the stare was gentle but brutal. "Care about me," he repeated slowly, tasting the words, "or care about what I do for M?" That's the question that starts wars in houses like this, because once you ask it, you can't unask it. You start looking at smiles like contracts. You start hearing affection like negotiation. Elvis lowered his voice again. "I don't even know who to trust." He paused, then said something that sounded like a man describing a trap he could feel closing. "I try to set one little boundary, and they act like I'm committing a crime." Then he looked toward the door, not like he feared the door itself, but what it represented. "They manage me," he said. "They manage my calls, my time, my rest, and they call it protection." Dr. Nick felt the weight of it, because he'd been part of the rest conversation. He'd been the one asked, again and again, to fix Elvis fast, not for Elvis's peace, for Elvis's function. And in that moment, Dr. Nick had to face a truth he didn't like. Medicine could be used as a pillow or a muzzle. Elvis leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and his voice got even softer. "You want to know what scares me?" Dr. Nick didn't answer. Elvis clenched his hands together like he was holding onto himself. "I think somebody in this house been talking, somebody been letting my business travel." Dr. Nick started to say something reassuring, but Elvis cut him off with a quick shake of the head. "Don't," Elvis whispered. "Don't give me that maybe not stuff. I feel it. I can feel it." He tapped his chest once, like the truth lived in his ribs. "Things I say in here show up out there." And that's when Dr. Nick understood the real poison of the situation. It didn't even matter if Elvis could prove it. When a man believes his private life has an audience, every relationship becomes a performance. Every friend becomes a potential witness. Every moment becomes evidence. That's how a home stops being a home. It becomes a set. Elvis sighed, long and exhausted, like he'd been carrying a boulder, and finally admitted it was killing him. "I'm not living in my house," he said again, quieter this time. I'm performing in it. Dr. Nick watched Elvis's face when he said it. No theatrics, no anger, just the flat sadness of someone realizing he's been smiling to survive. Outside the room, footsteps passed, a muted laugh, a voice, normal Graceland sounds, but inside the silence felt heavy, like it was pressurized. Then Elvis said something that made Dr. Nick's stomach tighten, because it wasn't just emotion. It was strategy. If I push back, Doc, they'll take everything, Elvis murmured, and they'll call it help. And there it was, the hostage logic, spoken like a prophecy. Not a gun to the head. 1,000 consequences stacked high enough to make you kneel anyway. Elvis wasn't afraid of strangers. He was afraid of what would happen if the machine decided he was a problem instead of a person. He was afraid of being painted as unstable. Afraid of losing his image. Afraid of losing people. Afraid that the second he stopped producing, the love would evaporate and leave paperwork behind. And Dr. Nick, standing there with his doctor's bag and his conscience, realized there were two kinds of help in Elvis's world. Help that heals, and help that controls. That night, the controlling kind was growing teeth. Because the pressure didn't stop at the door, it seeped into decisions, into recommendations, into what Dr. Nick was supposed to say. There were moments, quiet, quick moments, where someone would hint that the best thing for Elvis was to keep him resting. And resting didn't always mean sleep. Sometimes resting meant unavailable, untouchable, contained. Dr. Nick started to feel it, the unspoken expectation that his medical authority could be used like a lock. If the doctor says Elvis can't be disturbed, then the doctor becomes the gate. And if you control the gate, you control the man. That's when consequences began to show. People's faces tightened when Dr. Nick came around. Not hostile, exactly, watchful, like he'd become a variable they couldn't predict anymore. Conversations would stop when he walked into certain rooms. Questions would come wrapped in friendliness. How's he doing, Doc? But what they meant was, what did he say? What did he tell you? What do you know? And in the middle of all that, Elvis began to break in a way nobody could fix with charm. His eyes got duller on some nights, not from medication, but from defeat. His jokes became shorter. His patience thinner. He'd sit in silence longer than usual, like his mind was running away from him and he didn't have the strength to chase it. Then came the moment that, to Dr. Nick, felt like the true climax because it wasn't a headline moment, it wasn't dramatic, it was intimate. Elvis looked at him with a seriousness that made Dr. Nick want to look away. How do you get out, Elvis asked, when you're the product? There was no clever answer, no prescription. Just the sound of a man realizing his identity had been sold to the world, and now even his fear felt like an inconvenience. Dr. Nick tried to offer something, anything. We can figure out some boundaries, we can. Elvis shook his head slowly. You don't get it, he said, not angry, just exhausted. Boundaries ain't boundaries if folks don't respect 'em. He leaned back, and his voice got distant, like he was talking from the bottom of a deep well. I used to think I was the boss, he murmured. I used to think I could stop whenever I wanted. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender. And now I don't even believe that. Dr. Nick felt his own chest tighten, because in that sentence was the darkest truth of the whole story. Elvis didn't feel trapped by one villain. He felt trapped by a system, by a web of people, money, expectations, habits, and fear. A system where everybody could claim they loved him while still benefiting from his exhaustion. A system where the myth was more important than the man. And then Elvis said the line that haunted Dr. Nick, not because of what it accused, but because of what it admitted. If I stop, Elvis whispered, eyes fixed on nothing, they'll finally let me rest. Dr. Nick's throat went dry. Because Elvis didn't say it like he meant a nap. He said it like he meant the only kind of rest nobody can take from you. And in that moment, Dr. Nick understood the cruelty of this cage. The world would keep asking Elvis to carry it until Elvis couldn't. Dr. Nick stood there, listening to the silence after that sentence, and he knew this ends one of two ways. Either someone finally loosens the grip and lets Elvis breathe like a human being, or the machine keeps tightening until it breaks the man inside it. And the most terrifying part, Elvis didn't sound like a man who believed he got to choose. Elvis didn't sound like a man who believed he got to choose. And once you understand that, once you really sit with it, the whole myth starts to feel different, because people love to talk about Elvis like he was unstoppable, like he was this force of nature who could bend rooms with a glance and lift crowds with one note. But Dr. Nick's version of Elvis wasn't a force of nature. It was a man carrying a crown that got heavier until it started to feel like a chain. That's what makes the legacy part so hard to hear, not because it's sensational, because it's quiet, because it sounds like a truth nobody wants to claim responsibility for. After those nights, after those whispered confessions, after the sense of being watched and managed, Dr. Nick began to see Graceland like a living creature. The house had moods, it had rhythms, it had rules that weren't written anywhere, but everyone followed anyway. And the most painful rule of all was this. Elvis could be exhausted, hurting, scared, but the machine still expected Elvis. It expected him to show up smiling. It expected him to be grateful. It expected him to be fine. People have this idea that fame comes with freedom, that money buys you choices, that being adored by millions means you're never alone. But what Dr. Nick watched happen to Elvis was the opposite. The bigger Elvis became, the smaller his personal world got. Because the more people depended on him, the fewer people were willing to let him step back without punishment. That's the thing outsiders don't see. When someone becomes a living industry, rest is treated like rebellion. It's treated like betrayal. Elvis wasn't just one man making decisions for himself. He was the center of other people's livelihoods, identities, and sense of purpose. And that kind of dependence creates a dangerous illusion. People convince themselves they're entitled to you. Not because they hate you, because they love you. But love that doesn't respect your humanity stops being love. It becomes possession. Dr. Nick never forgot the way Elvis looked when he said, "They'll finally let me rest." A man doesn't say that because he's being dramatic. A man says that when he's losing hope that there's any other way out. And if you want to know what made Graceland tremble, the real reason people went silent when Dr. Nick hinted at what he'd seen, it wasn't because they were shocked Elvis was struggling. People knew he struggled. It was because Dr. Nick's perspective implied something far more uncomfortable. Elvis wasn't only trapped by what he took. He was trapped by what everyone took from him. His time, his privacy, his peace, his ability to say no and still be loved. And once that truth comes into the light, it forces a question nobody likes. If Elvis felt trapped inside the home we call his sanctuary, then who exactly was guarding the gate? Because there's a version of this story people prefer. It's clean, it's simple, it blames one thing. The Colonel, the pills, the press, the lifestyle, the curse of fame. But the truth Dr. Nick carried was messier. It was a system, a web, a machine where every person could tell themselves they were helping, while the cage kept closing anyway. And in that kind of machine, nobody has to be openly evil for harm to happen. All they have to do is keep expecting more. More access, Maury performances, Maury appearances, Maury compliance, Maury just one more time. Elvis tried to fight it in small ways. That's what makes it tragic. He wasn't completely unaware, he wasn't sleepwalking. He made attempts. He tried to shut the world out. He tried to slow things down. He tried to draw lines. A quiet night. A cancelled plan. A locked door. But each attempt was treated like a problem to solve, not a warning to hear. When Elvis wanted less noise, people increased the pressure. When Elvis wanted privacy, people argued over who had the right to be near him. When Elvis wanted peace, someone always had a reason why peace had to wait. And over time, that teaches a man something brutal. Even your needs become negotiable. Even your fear becomes inconvenient. Even your pain becomes something people manage instead of witness. Dr. Nick later chose his words carefully when he talked about Elvis, not because he was unsure of what he saw, but because he understood what happens when you say the wrong thing about a legend. People don't just argue. They defend the version that makes them comfortable. Because it's easier to believe Elvis was simply reckless than to believe Elvis felt cornered. It's easier to believe he did it to himself than to believe the people around him, maybe even well-meaning ones, treated him like an asset instead of a man. And that's the dangerous comfort of a single villain. If you blame one villain, everyone else gets to stay innocent. But Dr. Nick's story doesn't allow that comfort. It asks you to look at the whole room, at the way pressure moves through relationships, at the way loyalty can turn into control, at the way help can be used as a leash when the person receiving it doesn't get a vote. Because if Elvis was being managed, then the question becomes, managed for whose benefit? And even if no one ever stood there and said, "We are trapping him," it doesn't change the outcome if the outcome feels the same. A man who can't leave. A man who can't breathe. A man who feels watched. That's what made Graceland tremble. Not just because it's sad. Because it's chilling. Graceland is a symbol to the world, a place fans dream about, a shrine, a storybook setting. So if the truth inside Graceland is that Elvis sometimes felt like he was performing even at home, then the shrine becomes something else. It becomes evidence. Evidence that the legend wasn't protected. It was consumed. And that's where the legacy shifts from nostalgia into warning. Because Elvis's story is not just a tragedy of one man's decline. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when someone becomes everyone's emotional property. Fans claim him. Business claims him. Friends claim him. The public claims him. Even the people closest claim him in the name of love. And somewhere in the middle, the man himself starts disappearing. You can love Elvis and still admit that. In fact, if you love him, you have to admit it. Because the honest version of Elvis isn't weaker than the myth. He's more human, more heartbreaking, more real. Dr. Nick's confession, what he revealed, wasn't a salacious secret meant to entertain. It was a moral truth. That Elvis didn't need more love from the world. He needed fewer demands from the people closest to him. That's a haunting sentence because it flips everything. We think of Elvis as someone drowning in attention. But Dr. Nick's version suggests Elvis was starving for something attention can't provide. Safety, trust, silence that isn't suspicious. A room where no is allowed. A home where the door can close without somebody outside deciding what it means. And that's why, even now, decades later, this story still stirs people up. Because it forces a hard question about legacy. Was Elvis's greatest tragedy the choices he made? Or the fact that the world and his circle kept pushing him to be Elvis even when he needed to be a man? That's where the final twist lands. Not a reveal about a hidden villain. A reveal about a hidden truth. Elvis tried to escape in ways that didn't look dramatic enough for history to remember. He tried to get out without burning everything down. He tried to step back without declaring war. He tried to quietly reclaim himself. But quiet escapes don't work when the people around you profit from your presence. In the end, Dr. Nick's line, whether he said it directly or implied it through what he refused to deny, was this: "I treated the symptoms and the cage kept closing." That one sentence explains why this isn't just an Elvis story. It's a human story. Because it's what happens when everyone focuses on keeping someone functional instead of keeping them free. And if you want the last image, the one that sticks, you don't need a dramatic scene. You need that hallway feeling. The soft lamp under a door. A phone that doesn't ring because someone decided it shouldn't. Footsteps that pass and pause outside a room like access is being negotiated. A man inside, famous enough to fill stadiums, quiet enough to be ignored in his own home. That's the tremble. Not the walls shaking. The soul of the place shifting because the truth was finally too close to hide. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. You start rewatching old footage differently. You start hearing the pauses in his voice. You start wondering what it cost him to smile. And maybe that's the only justice a story like this can offer. Not blame, awareness. Because Elvis didn't just leave us songs. He left us a warning about what happens when love turns into entitlement and when the world confuses a legend for a life. If Elvis truly felt trapped inside the life we all celebrated, then the real question isn't just who failed him, it's why nobody could slow the machine down. So tell me in the comments, do you think Elvis was trapped by the people around him or by the legend itself? If you want more untold Elvis stories told with honesty, emotion, and the details nobody dares to say out loud, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us.